In 2011, in the city of Jackson, Mississippi, Jerome J. Miller was murdered. He was the 38-year-old owner of a small but beloved music club, Blue Note, a place that had become a staple of the local jazz and blues scene. For years, he had worked tirelessly to build the club's reputation, hosting live music nights, giving young musicians a stage, and keeping the atmosphere welcoming yet vibrant. The club was more than just a business to him, it was a part of the community. But Jackson's South Side was controlled by the Southside Kings, a violent criminal organization that ran drugs, illegal gambling, and extortion rackets. Their influence stretched deep into the city's underworld, and they had a history of taking what they wanted by force. When they approached Jerome with an offer to buy Blue Note, it was not a request. It was a demand. They wanted the club as a front for their operations, a clean, respectable business through which they could launder money, host meetings, and establish a foothold in a neighborhood that had resisted their control. Jerome refused. The threat started subtly, strangers watching him from across the street, broken windows, anonymous warnings to reconsider his decision. But Jerome was stubborn. He had worked too hard to let criminals take away something he had built with his own hands. He ignored the warnings, continued running his club as usual, and even spoke openly about refusing to bow to pressure. His defiance made him a target. One night, Blue Note burned. The fire started after closing, consuming the building within minutes. Firefighters arrived too late to save anything, and by morning, all that remained were charred ruins and the smell of smoke lingering in the air. But the fire was only part of the message. Witnesses later claimed that Jerome had still been inside when the attackers arrived. He had been beaten, dragged outside, and forced into a car. No one intervened. No one called the police. The next day, the rumors spread, Jerome Miller was gone. His body was found 2 days later in a swamp on the outskirts of Jackson. He had been tortured before he died. His hands were bound, his ribs shattered, and his face bruised beyond recognition. He had been shot twice in the chest and dumped in the muddy water. There were no signs of robbery. His wallet was still in his pocket. His wedding ring remained on his finger. It was an execution, a statement meant to instill fear in anyone else who might dare to defy the Southside Kings. The police launched an investigation, but it was clear from the start that justice would not come easily. The crime scene yielded little evidence. The fire had destroyed the club and any potential clues it might have contained. Security cameras from nearby businesses had conveniently malfunctioned that night. Witnesses refused to speak, afraid of meeting the same fate as Jerome. Within a week, the case was closed. The official report labeled it as a botched robbery, a random act of violence in a city where such things happened too often. The real story remained buried beneath silence and fear. The only person who refused to accept the official version was Jerome's younger brother, Darius Miller. At 22, Darius had looked up to his brother as both a mentor and a father figure. Jerome had raised him after their parents died, kept him out of trouble, and taught him the value of hard work. Losing him in such a brutal and senseless way shattered something inside Darius. He knew who was responsible. He didn't need evidence or confessions. The Southside Kings had made their message clear. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different things. Darius had no power, no connections, and no way to fight back. He was just another young man from Jackson, another person the world would forget if he pushed too hard and ended up in the same swamp where they had dumped his brother. So he left. One morning, without saying goodbye, without attending Jerome's funeral, he packed a bag and disappeared. People assumed he went north, maybe to Atlanta, maybe to Chicago. Some said he had joined the military, others that he had fallen into the same criminal world that had taken his brother's life. In truth, no one knew for sure. For 10 years, Darius Miller ceased to exist. And then, a decade later, he returned. In the fall of 2021, Darius Miller returned to Jackson, Mississippi, but he was no longer the same man who had left a decade earlier. The name on his identification was different. His face bore the quiet hardness of someone who had lived through things most people couldn't imagine. The years had changed him in ways that went far beyond appearance. He had learned patience. He had learned how to wait. After leaving Jackson in 2011, he had drifted from city to city, surviving however he could. He had no real direction, no plan, just the burning knowledge that his brother's killers still walked free. Anger drove him, but anger alone wasn't enough. In time, survival took priority. He found work where he could, sometimes legal, sometimes not. He spent time with the wrong people, learned the ways of criminals not as an outsider, but as one of them. He adapted. Eventually, trouble caught up to him. A failed armed robbery in Louisiana ended with a prison sentence. He spent 6 years behind bars, watching, listening, learning. Prison was a different kind of world, a place where patience meant survival. He observed how men carried themselves, how they manipulated others, how alliances formed and shattered. He learned that violence had a language of its own, a rhythm dictated by power and fear. He watched those who ruled inside the prison walls and studied their methods. He understood that brute force was never enough. Control came from knowing when to strike and when to wait. By the time he was released, he was no longer Darius Miller. He had a new identity, forged documents, and a different name, Daryl Carter. The name meant nothing to him, but it was useful. It allowed him to move without his past following him. Under that name, he built himself into someone the world wouldn't question, a man who could exist in the shadows without drawing attention. When he finally returned to Jackson, the city looked the same, but everything about it felt different. He had changed, but so had the people who had once controlled the streets. The Southside Kings still ruled the Southern District, but they were no longer the reckless street gang they had been a decade ago. Their leader, Lamont Big L. Randolph, had grown older, more careful. He no longer dealt with small-time extortion and street-level drug sales. He had turned the Kings into something bigger, a machine that ran clubs, underground casinos, and high-end drug distribution. The violence was still there, but it was cleaner, more precise. The organization had money now, real money, and Lamont had surrounded himself with men who ensured his empire remained untouched. Daryl knew he couldn't come back as a ghost from the past. If anyone recognized him as Darius Miller, his plan would end before it even began. He needed to become someone new, someone insignificant, someone who could slip into their world without raising suspicion. He started with small jobs, working for people connected to the Kings, keeping his head down, proving himself reliable but unremarkable. He never asked questions. He never offered opinions. He understood that the key to survival wasn't making an impression, it was blending in so well that people forgot you were even there. After months of calculated patience, he found his way to Lamont's inner circle through a trusted lieutenant. They needed a driver, someone quiet, someone dependable, someone who wouldn't draw attention. Daryl fit the role perfectly. Driving for Lamont was more than just a job. It was access. It allowed him to be close, to listen, to observe. Lamont rarely spoke directly about business, but his men did. Daryl learned who held power within the organization, who was trusted, who was disposable. He listened to their conversations, memorized names, tracked their habits. He pieced together the structure of the Kings, noting every weakness, every potential crack in their foundation. And then, finally, he found what he had been searching for. The men who had killed Jerome Miller were still there. Some had risen through the ranks, securing positions of influence within the Kings. Others had remained foot soldiers, still carrying out orders like they had a decade ago. Daryl knew their names now. He knew their routines. He knew where they slept, who they trusted, what they feared. There were 6 of them. For months, he did nothing. He waited, blending into the background, just another nameless employee in Lamont's growing empire. He was patient, just as he had learned to be. He had spent 10 years becoming a man who could wait. Now, it was time. In the spring of 2022, the killings began. They were not random acts of violence, nor were they the result of street-level disputes. These deaths were calculated, deliberate, and carried a message that only a handful of men in Jackson could understand. The first to disappear was Terrence T-Bo Brown. He had been with the Southside Kings for years, one of the trusted enforcers who had carried out the most brutal tasks without question. He had a reputation for being ruthless, a man who had long since stopped fearing consequences. But none of that mattered in the end. T-Bo vanished one night without a trace. He had left a bar on the south side of town and never made it home. His absence didn't immediately raise alarms. Men like him often disappeared for a few days, caught up in drugs, women, or business that took them outside the city. But when a full day passed with no sign of him, his crew started making calls. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. His car was still parked outside the bar where he had last been seen. 2 days later, a homeless man stumbled into an abandoned house near the old rail yard and found T-Bo's body. His kneecap had been shattered by a close-range gunshot, his throat cut so deeply that his head was nearly severed. The blood had dried in thick pools beneath him, the air heavy with the metallic scent of death. On the wall beside him, carved into the rotting wood, were 2 words, "You remember?" Word spread fast. The police came, but there was little to investigate. No one had seen anything, no one had heard anything, and even if they had, no one was willing to talk. The detectives labeled it as gang violence, another score settled between rivals. But inside the Southside Kings, the reaction was different. Those who had been around long enough to know the past recognized the warning. 2 weeks later, James Slick Harris was found dead in his home. His death appeared to be a suicide. The gun was still in his hand, a single bullet hole in his temple. His body was slumped in his chair, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. A note lay nearby, but it offered no insight into his reasons. It contained no apology, no last words, just a few meaningless lines about regret and time running out. The police ruled it as self-inflicted, another statistic in a city that had seen too many men like Slick meet the same fate. But within the Kings, the tension grew. Slick had been one of them for years, a man who had seen and done things that should have hardened him against fear. Suicide didn't fit. Then Marlon Chain Davis died. His death was louder, more violent. It left no room for doubt. One evening, as he pulled into the driveway of his home, his car exploded. The blast shattered windows in neighboring houses, sending flames into the night sky. By the time emergency responders arrived, there was nothing left of him but burned remains inside the twisted wreckage. The official cause was listed as a car bomb, likely tied to gang retaliation. But those who had been watching closely knew better. The pattern was impossible to ignore. 3 men, all with connections to the Southside Kings. 3 men who had been involved in the murder of Jerome Miller a decade earlier. 3 men who had been hunted down and eliminated in different ways, but with one common thread: the past had come for them. Inside the organization, fear began to spread. The older members, those who had been part of the crew during the early years, started watching their backs. Conversations became hushed, accusations whispered behind closed doors. Some thought it was another gang moving in, sending a message before making their move. Others weren't so sure. The paranoia took hold. Those who had been involved in the Blue Note incident couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. It was too precise, too personal. Someone wasn't just killing them, they were making a statement. The message on the wall beside T-Bo's body echoed in their minds. Daryl watched from the background as the Kings grew uneasy. He saw the way they changed their routines, how they avoided traveling alone, how they checked over their shoulders when leaving a building. They were growing smaller, not in numbers, but in confidence. The weight of fear had begun to crush them. And he wasn't done yet. After the 3rd death, Lamont Randolph knew he could no longer ignore what was happening. It was not a coincidence, not random violence. Someone was targeting his people with precision, eliminating them one by one. The message was clear, though the sender remained hidden. Fear spread through the Southside Kings like a sickness, and it was only a matter of time before the weight of paranoia forced someone to break. Lamont reacted the only way he knew how, by locking down his empire. Clubs and bars that once operated freely under his protection now ran under heavy security or closed their doors entirely. Movement was restricted. No one went anywhere alone. Orders were given through trusted intermediaries, face-to-face meetings were kept to a minimum, and even those within the inner circle found themselves under scrutiny. The man who had once ruled the South Side with absolute control now trusted no one. His men felt the shift. Some questioned if it was even worth staying. The power and wealth they had enjoyed under Lamont were meaningless if they couldn't sleep at night. No one said it out loud, but the fear was evident in their eyes. They were being hunted. Lamont brought in outside help. He hired men from out of town, professionals with no ties to Jackson, men who could act without personal bias. Their job was simple: find whoever was behind the killings and make them disappear before another body turned up. They searched the city for patterns, questioning informants, bribing low-level criminals, leaning on anyone who might have heard even the faintest whisper of information. But they found nothing. Whoever was doing this was careful, methodical, and left no trace. Darrell watched the panic spread. He had spent months working his way into the background of Lamont's operation, embedding himself so deeply that he was just another face in the crowd. But he knew his time was limited. With every death, the search for the killer intensified. It would not be long before suspicion landed on everyone, and he could not afford to be caught in that net. He needed to act before the circle closed around him. Julius J.J. Collins was Lamont's right-hand man. He had been with the Southside Kings for years, trusted more than anyone else. He was the one Lamont confided in, the one who handled the things Lamont didn't want to be directly involved in. He had built his career on loyalty, and for that, he had been rewarded with power and protection. But none of that mattered when the past came for him. One night, after leaving a bar well past midnight, J.J. disappeared. No one knew exactly when it happened. He had left alone, waved off his driver, and walked to his car. Somewhere between the parking lot and his home, he was taken. No witnesses. No security cameras. Just silence. 3 days later, his body surfaced in the river. He had been bound, his wrists tied behind his back, his ankles secured with thick rope. A large stone had been fastened to his chest, meant to drag him to the bottom. But the knots had loosened over time, and the current had carried him toward the shore. His skin was pale, bloated from the water, but the message carved into his palm was still legible. "You remember?" The sight of JJ's body sent a shockwave through Lamont's organization. This was not just another soldier, not an enforcer or a low-level player. This was the man closest to Lamont, the one he relied on more than anyone else. His death was not just a warning, it was a declaration. Lamont unraveled. His paranoia turned to rage. He demanded answers, but there were none. He accused his own men, convinced that someone had betrayed him from the inside. He threatened, interrogated, pushed until even his most loyal men began to doubt him. The fear that had been growing within the organization reached its peak. The Southside Kings had always operated on respect and fear in equal measure. They controlled the streets because they were untouchable, because those who opposed them disappeared without a trace. But now, they were the ones being hunted. Lamont's power had been built on the foundation of control, and that control was slipping. He could no longer ignore the truth. This was not a rival gang. This was not some outsider looking to claim his territory. This was someone who knew him, someone who understood his organization from the inside, someone who remembered things that most had long since forgotten. Someone was coming for him. And he had no idea who it was. By the summer of 2022, Lamont Randolph was no longer the man he once was. The fear that had infected his organization had reached him, twisting his thoughts, stripping away the confidence that had made him untouchable for years. He rarely left his mansion on the outskirts of Jackson, a sprawling estate built to showcase the wealth and power he had accumulated over decades. The property was surrounded by a high fence, guarded at all hours by armed men. Security cameras covered every entrance, motion sensors lined the perimeter, and reinforced steel doors ensured no one could enter unnoticed. But fear had a way of making even the most secure places feel vulnerable. Lamont had seen his empire shrink around him, not from the pressure of the police or rival gangs, but from something he couldn't understand. His most trusted men were gone, picked off one by one, their deaths carrying messages from a past he had long since buried. He had spent months trying to find the one responsible, but the more he searched, the less he found. It was like chasing a ghost, an enemy that existed in the spaces between his own paranoia and reality. On the night of July 15th, the ghost finally came for him. At exactly 2:37 a.m., the estate went dark. The power cut out in an instant, silencing the hum of security systems, killing the glow of exterior lights. Inside, confusion rippled through the guards. The backup generator should have kicked in immediately, but it didn't. Something had gone wrong. Then came the gunfire. It started outside, near the rear gate. Suppressed shots, muffled but lethal, cutting through the quiet night. The guards never had a chance to react. The first was hit in the head, crumpling before he could even turn toward the source of the sound. The second managed to raise his weapon before a bullet tore through his throat, sending him staggering backward. The house remained silent. Inside, the guards near the main entrance hesitated, unsure if the noise outside had been real or a trick of their exhausted minds. Then another shot rang out, closer this time. Someone was inside. Daryl moved through the house like a shadow, his steps precise, his aim unerring. He knew the layout. He had memorized it in the months leading up to this moment, studying the movements of Lamont's men, learning where they stationed themselves, where they felt safest. He used that knowledge against them. A guard patrolling the hallway near the kitchen barely had time to register the figure emerging from the darkness before he was shot twice in the chest. Another, stationed near the staircase, turned at the sound of the body hitting the floor but was too slow to react. Daryl took him down with a single shot to the head. By the time the remaining men inside realized what was happening, it was too late. They fumbled with their weapons, scrambling for cover, calling out warnings that no one would live long enough to hear. Lamont had retreated to his office on the second floor. He had locked the door behind him, gripping the handle of his gun with sweaty fingers, heart pounding in his chest. The safe in the corner held more weapons, more ammunition, but he didn't move toward it. He just stood there, listening to the sounds of his men dying one by one. Then there was silence. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe it was over. Maybe his men had won. Maybe this was just another failed attempt to reach him. Then the door creaked. The lock had been shot out. The handle turned slowly. Lamont raised his gun, aiming it toward the opening, his breath uneven. The door swung inward, revealing the figure standing in the doorway. He knew. The moment he saw the man before him, he understood. The deaths, the messages, the slow, methodical destruction of everything he had built, it had all led to this moment. The past had not just come back to haunt him. It had come back to kill him. Lamont fired first. The shot was rushed, panicked. It missed. Daryl did not. The bullet struck Lamont in the leg, sending him crashing to the floor. His gun slid from his hand, clattering against the hardwood. He tried to crawl toward it, but the next shot took him in the shoulder, stopping him cold. Daryl moved forward, stepping over the body of the man who had once ruled the South Side with an iron grip. He grabbed the back of Lamont's shirt, dragging him across the floor, through the hallway, down the stairs. Blood smeared the polished wood as Lamont gasped in pain, his body weak, his strength gone. By the time they reached the living room, Lamont could barely keep his eyes open. Daryl dropped him into a chair, pulling a roll of duct tape from his pocket, securing the older man's wrists and ankles to the frame. The pain had made Lamont delirious, his head lolling forward, breath shallow. Daryl wasn't finished. He pulled out his knife, the same one he had used on Thibault, the same one that had carved messages into flesh and wood alike. Slowly, deliberately, he pressed the blade to Lamont's chest, cutting deep, carving the words that had followed each of the others into death. You remember. Lamont shuddered as the pain cut through his haze of shock. He tried to speak, tried to beg, but his body had given up. Blood soaked his shirt, pooling at his waist, dripping onto the floor beneath him. Darrell reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph. The edges were burned, the colors faded, but the image was still clear, Jerome Miller standing in front of the Blue Note, smiling, unaware that his days were numbered. Darrell tucked the photo into Lamont's jacket pocket. Then he disappeared. The house was silent once more. By morning, the police would arrive. They would find the bodies of Lamont's men, scattered throughout the mansion like discarded pieces of a broken empire. They would find Lamont himself, barely alive, tied to a chair, bleeding out beneath the message carved into his flesh. They would find the photograph. And they would wonder who had done this. But no one would have the answer. When the police arrived at Lamont Randolph's estate, they found nothing but death. The once imposing mansion, a symbol of power and wealth, had been reduced to a silent graveyard. Bodies lay scattered throughout the house, some slumped against walls, others collapsed in doorways. Blood stained the floors, soaking into the expensive carpets, seeping into the cracks of the wooden staircases. The air was thick with the metallic scent of gunpowder and death, the remnants of a battle fought in the shadows. The security team, the enforcers, the trusted lieutenants, every last one of them was dead. Some had been shot cleanly, others had struggled, their final moments marked by desperation. The few who had managed to fire back had been outmatched, their bodies frozen in positions of futile resistance. It had been swift, methodical, and brutal. And in the center of it all sat Lamont Randolph. The once feared king of the Southside Kings was barely clinging to life. His body was weak from blood loss, his skin pale and clammy. He had been bound to a chair, his arms and legs immobilized, his breathing shallow. The officers who found him had to look twice before realizing he was still alive. He had been carved up, a message etched into his chest, the deep letters still raw and bleeding. You remember. But the person responsible for the carnage was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no security footage, no fingerprints, no footprints. Whoever had done this had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only corpses and unanswered questions. The investigation began immediately. Detectives combed through the estate, searching for any clue as to who had orchestrated the massacre. Theories swirled. Some believed it had been a rival gang making a bold move to seize control. Others suspected an inside betrayal, a power struggle that had ended in blood. But nothing added up. The precision, the execution, the lack of any clear suspects, it didn't fit the pattern of street warfare. Witnesses from the surrounding area reported hearing distant gunfire in the middle of the night, but no one had seen anything. No one had noticed any unusual activity, no vehicles fleeing the scene, no masked men storming the property. It was as if the killer had materialized from the darkness, carried out his mission, and disappeared into the wind. The only real clue left behind was the photograph. Detectives found it tucked inside Lamont's jacket pocket, a faded, scorched image of Jerome Miller standing outside the Blue Note. Its presence raised more questions than answers. Some of the older officers remembered the case, the club owner who had been murdered years ago, the crime that had never been solved. The photo suggested a connection, but it was impossible to know what it meant. Jerome Miller had been dead for over a decade, and his younger brother, Darius, had disappeared just as long ago. As the investigation stalled, rumors began to spread. Whispers moved through the streets of Jackson, speculation and fear intertwining. Some believed the man behind the massacre had fled the city, disappearing into the anonymity of another town, another state, another life. Others were certain he had been killed, his body dumped in some unmarked grave, erased just as efficiently as those he had come for. But there were those who thought differently. Stories began circulating in the South Side, passed in hushed tones between those who had survived the fall of the Kings. Some claimed they had seen a man watching from the shadows in the weeks leading up to the attack, tall, quiet, familiar. A ghost from the past. Others swore they had heard a name spoken in fear, a name that had not been uttered in years. Darius Miller. His name had been forgotten for a decade, buried beneath the weight of time and silence. But now, it was back. Some believed he had returned for revenge and vanished once his work was done. Others thought he was still out there, waiting, watching, preparing for whatever came next. The rumors only grew stronger when, weeks after the massacre, a message appeared in the ruins of the old Blue Note. The club had never been rebuilt after the fire. The lot remained empty, overgrown with weeds, the remnants of its foundation barely visible beneath the layers of neglect. It had become just another forgotten place in a city that moved too fast to remember its past. But one morning, a new mark appeared on the crumbling brick. Spray-painted in bold, black letters, simple yet chilling. I remember. The police dismissed it as graffiti, the act of some anonymous vandal looking to stir up trouble. But for those who had been part of the Southside Kings, those who had seen what happened to Lamont and his men, it meant something else. It meant the past was not done with them. It meant that somewhere, whether in Jackson or far beyond its borders, the ghost of Darius Miller still lingered. And they would never be safe again.